Greetings. Hello, Jurud, Tanakoto Katoa, and welcome everyone to this meeting. Thank you for joining us today for this very crucial roundtable discussion. It's my honor to be one of the facilitators of this meeting and be among such dedicated experts and advocates who are united in commitments to human rights and justice. My name is Nagar Pato. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Middle East in Indiana University. I just moved from New Zealand, so Australia is very close to my heart. And I'm also a member of the supervisory board of the International Community of Iranian Academics. My research focuses on the dynamics of religion and politics and its impact on human rights. I study the Middle East security environment and human security in international organizations. Today's online event is organized by the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists and the International Community of Iranian Academics. The National Assembly of Iranian Jurists, or NAIJ, was established in response to the powerful and widespread woman-led protests in Iran in 2022. This group consists of jurists who bring a wealth of knowledge in comparative law, policy, transnational justice, Iranian law, and human rights. NAIJ operates as a nonprofit public policy organization with the aim of promoting democracy and justice in Iran. It strives to provide the necessary legal and policy expertise to establish a secular and a stable democracy that ensures the fundamental rights of all Iranians. Mr. Faraz Maghami, a key founding member of NAIJ, will lead today's discussions. The International Community of Iranian Academics, or ICOIA, represent an independent and international network of Iranian academics and students. This network was formed during the Woman Life Freedom Revolution and serves as a voice for those, particularly academics and university students, who have suffered under oppressive policies, expulsion, persecution, and tortures in the hands of the Islamic Republic. ICOIA is dedicated to advocating for human rights and equality in Iran. Since their inception, both NAIJ and ICOIA have focused on raising awareness and encouraging public discourse. Today's session explores the actions taken by Canada and Australia in supporting the people of Iran during what is the first woman-led revolution in the Middle East. This discussion is very timely and critical as tensions between Israel and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, intensifies and the volatility of regional security exacerbates. In the past year alone, we have seen Hezbollah launch thousands of missiles at northern parts of Israel. The IRGC fired 200 missiles towards Israel on the last day of September 2024 from Iran, and they also have provided military support to Russia in their occupation of Ukraine. On the domestic front in Iran, the human rights situation has seen no improvement, and the state's misogynistic policies continue unabated. A notable recent example is the passage of a legislation by the Islamic Republic's parliament that effectively legitimizes the public harassment of women over their hijab. This comes in the context where key military figures like Neil Furushan, who was killed in the attack against Hezbollah, actively contributed to policies of brutality and repression against protesters in Iran during the Woman Life Freedom Revolution. In response to some of these actions, and particularly to the shooting of the Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, Canada added the IRGC in its list of terrorist organizations in 2024. Today, and in these discussions, we aim to learn more about the responses of Canada and Australia to these significant regional challenges and their support of woman life freedom revolution. We in NAIJ and ICOIA extend our utmost gratitude to our presenters for participating in today's discussions, and we are delighted to have them. We look forward to gaining insights from your expertise and experiences. And of course, our many thanks to our participants for your presence and engagement. Now, before I leave the floor to my colleague, Mr. Faraz Maghami, I would like to do a short introduction of him. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Faraz Maghami, who's a distinguished barrister practicing from Sydney Bar in Australia. Mr. Maghami brings to his practice an extensive international advisory profile with clients across the Pacific nations, the United Kingdoms, Europe, and the United States. His expertise expands public international law, national security, organized crime, anti-money laundering, and counterterrorism financing, military law, and matters involving covert and intelligence gathering commissions, as well as other clandestine government and Gathering Commission, as well as other clandestine government institutions. With over 90 years of experience, Mr. Maghami is the advocate for the rights and freedoms of individuals facing injustice and repression, not only Iranians, but also globally. His dedicated efforts extend to his role with the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists, which is a non-profit public policy organization. With further ado, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and the floor is yours, Faraz.
Well, thank you, Negar, for that wholesome introduction. Can I take my own opportunity and welcome each and every one of you to what I called last year a star-studded and distinguished lineup, and it is absolutely the same today. Can I, before I commence the introductions of our esteemed panelists this morning, raise one point for the benefit of all who are either watching this live or those who will watch the recording. This morning, our team was reliably informed that our friends and those people interested in this session from inside Iran had been prevented. The links have gone dead, and unfortunately, their access to today's session, at least on a live basis, was prevented. I must say that I'm not surprised, but of course, I am wholly disappointed at this. But our commitment, NAIJ's commitment and ICOIA's commitment, and the larger Iranian diaspora's commitment to open, fair, and full dialogue and press requires us to make sure that everyone and anybody who's interested in this session has access to it. So we will be recording this session, we will upload it, and we make a commitment to you watching this now, the recording, I suspect, to get it in your hands and make sure that you have the opportunity to hear from politicians both from Australia and from Canada. So with that sad indictment of what is going on in Iran, can I perhaps take the opportunity to say a very short summary of why we're ultimately all here today. It's been some 2 years since Mahsa Jina Amini was murdered whilst in the custody of the morality police in Iran. The Iranian diaspora all around the world, in Australia and Canada especially, but everywhere really, have been urging the governments to diplomatically pressure Iran by doing a number of things: expelling ambassadors, designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC or SEPA in Farsi, as terrorist organizations, oppose Iran's election to various committees. And now with the complete unraveling, it seems, of the Middle East, all those calls and the urgency of those calls should be heeded. Now, on this roundtable, we hope to delve into some of the steps, achievements, things we can potentially do better in the diaspora, and the governments who, in fact, speak on behalf of the dual citizens of Iran and Australia and Canada in responding to their call, that is to the call of the diaspora, in doing what they can to assist the Iranian people, to help continue this fight, and to make sure that this cause of woman life freedom and the uprising and the revolution of the woman life freedom to continue. But can I stop talking now because I suspect I'm the last person that all the audience are here to hear from. Can I take an opportunity to introduce our panelists? And what I propose to do is introduce each of them now and give the background, and I will invite each of them to say a few words before we go to our live Q&A session. I'm also just being prompted for the lovely audience. There is a live Q&A session. You will have the opportunity to type your questions, as you will see in the bottom of the screen. Those questions, I will be assisted by a sifting process by our team members, and I will put those questions to each of our esteemed panelists. Now, can I perhaps start with our panelist, with Tim Watts, the Honourable Tim Watts MP. So Tim is a federal member of Gellibrand in Victoria and has served as the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Albanese government since 2022. He was first elected to the House of Reps back in 2013, and for at least a decade has served as one of the most diverse electorates in Australia. Before entering Parliament, Tim worked in the tech sector as a senior manager at Telstra and then a solicitor at Mallison Stephen Jacques, now Kingswood and Mallisons. He has worked on critical tech issues, including the rollout of the NBN and a number of other aspects whilst there. He also worked as the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Minister of Communication and a senior advisor to the Victorian Premier, as he then was, John Brumby. Tim is the author of, I think, at least 2 books, The Golden Country, Australia's Changing Identity, and 2 features, Australia at a Critical Moment, along with co-authors, fellow MP Claire O'Neill. As noted, Kim holds a Bachelor of Laws from Bond University and a Master of Public Policy from Monash University, as well as a Master of Science in Political Communication from LSE in London. I said this last year, and I'll say it again, an all-round nice guy, and it seems a good friend and a good point of contact for the Iranian Australian community here in Australia. Tim, if I might invite you to say a few words.
Well, thank you for that very, very kind introduction, Farouz, and thank you also, Negar. Can I also acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues on the line and give a special thank you and welcome to Mr. Ali Asahi, MP, joining us all the way from Canada on this call. There'll be many things that we'll discuss today, but just echoing Farouz's comments to begin this call, I think it's worth us reflecting on the privilege that we have living in countries like Australia and Canada, the freedoms that we have living in open and liberal democratic societies to express our views, to organise, to advocate. There is much that we can disagree on in the Middle East that good faith people can come to different conclusions on. But the fact that we can have this conversation in good faith and engage constructively really matters. And the fact that it's denied to other people makes it matter even more. So thank you for everyone that's participating today. And thank you to the international community of Iranian academics and the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists for organising and hosting this event. I'm pleased to receive the invitation to attend this event again after last year's, I think, very constructive roundtable. We are meeting today in very challenging times. We are deeply concerned as a government by the continued escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. There has been far too much loss of life in the region already, and Australia condemns Iran's dangerous escalation of this conflict. We, alongside the global community, including Canada, have been clear in our calls for de-escalation, and we repeat our urgent diplomatic call for diplomatic solutions in the Middle East and for immediate ceasefires in Lebanon and in Gaza. Further hostilities put civilians at risk. It's women and children that pay the highest price for conflicts of this kind. This destructive cycle of violence must end. And I acknowledge Mahsa Jina Amini's incarceration and tragic death just over 2 years ago, and the Iranian authorities' violent crackdown on the women, life and freedom protests that were sparked by her death. I acknowledge the immense bravery of the people of Iran, particularly Iran's women and girls, who have spent so many years fighting to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms in the face of brutal repression. Now, in the 2 years since Mahsa Jina Amini was killed, the Albanese government has worked closely with international partners to hold Iran to account. We're at the forefront of efforts to remove Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. We co-sponsored and advocated for the successful UN Human Rights Council resolution establishing an independent investigation into human rights violations in Iran. We've joined with international partners to publicly condemn Iran's abhorrent human rights violations, including its persecution of women and girls and execution of political opponents and protesters. We bolstered Australia's Iran Autonomous Sanctions Framework to allow us to sanction individuals and entities involved in the oppression of women and girls in Iran, the general oppression of people in Iran, the undermining of good governance or the rule of law in Iran, and in assisting Iran to threaten or undermine the sovereignty or territorial integrity of another country. And in the last 2 years, our government has used this expanded framework to sanction 195 Iranian-linked individuals and entities that have contributed to Iran's serious human rights violations. And again, these serious human rights violations have included the oppression of women and girls, the obstruction of the right to freedom of expression, Iran's regionally destabilizing behavior, including its proliferation and supply of missile and drone technologies to its proxies, Iran's supply of drones to Russia that have been used against Ukraine, and Iran's continued development of its nuclear and missile programs. This brings Australia's total sanctions on Iran-linked individuals and entities to 290. Prime Minister Wong imposed our most recent sanctions on the second anniversary of Mahsa Jina Amini's death. And these sanctions targeted 5 senior law enforcement and security officials complicit in Iran's violent repression of protests. Minister Wong also joined her US, UK, Canadian, and New Zealand counterparts in a public statement to mark this solemn event. The Australian government is committed to addressing Iran's human rights violations. Our statement highlighted that women and girls continue to face severe repression in Iran, including due to a recent violent campaign of arrests and intimidation to enforce mandatory hijab compliance. We've also highlighted Iran's status as one of the foremost executioners of women globally. We expressed our collective shock at the recent surge in unfair trials, death penalties, and executions in Iran, especially for human rights defenders. It's horrifying that credible reports show that 853 people were executed in Iran in 2023, and that already more than 430 people have been executed this year. We will continue to call on Iran to cease its use of the death penalty. We understand that there is more work to do to address Iran's ongoing human rights violations, and we will continue to advocate for change on behalf of the Iranian people. We want to see the rights of Iranian people, including its women and girls, human rights defenders, ethnic and religious minorities, political opponents, and protesters, protected absolutely. Now, I understand that there is an enduring interest in what action Australia is taking to hold a particular element of the Iranian state, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to account. I want to reassure you that the government is acutely aware of the IRGC's malign behaviour inside Iran and within the Middle East region, and indeed around the world. We've been active and consistent in calling out the IRGC's problematic and destabilising conduct, including its egregious human rights violations and support for regional armed groups. And while you have heard us explain that the IRGC as an organ of a nation state is not the kind of entity that is covered by the terrorist organisations provisions in Australia's criminal code, the government has taken meaningful action to ensure that the IRGC faces consequences for its conduct. Australia has imposed sanctions on the IRGC as a whole since the Gillard government put them in place in 2010. And since Mahsa Jina Amini's death 2 years ago, the Albanese government has sanctioned almost 100 individuals and entities with links to the IRGC. And this includes, in May of this year, sanctioning the IRGC Navy and the head of the IRGC's Quds Force. We'll continue to use available tools to address the community's well-founded concerns about the IRGC. We'll also continue to use our diplomatic presence in Iran and Iran's corresponding presence here to call for a change in Iran's behaviour. And just last week in New York, Foreign Minister Wong pressed Iran's new Foreign Minister on the urgent need for regional de-escalation and restraint, and raised Australia's concerns about human rights. Now, while my comments today have focused on human rights and Iran's destabilising behaviour, I also want to make a particular point that the government takes seriously the threat of foreign interference and transnational repression. We do not tolerate surveillance, harassment, or intimidation of any members of the Australian community, and encourage you and your family members and those in your extended networks to report any and all incidents of this kind that may come to your knowledge. Thank you to everyone on this call for your interest in our position and our actions on Iran, and for providing me this opportunity to talk with you and to answer your questions here today. Thank you, Forrest.
Many thanks, Tim, and thank you for recognising that there is an ongoing and perpetual interest in what not just Australia, but what Australia especially does in relation to the IRGC question. We'll come back to that in due course. Can I now take the opportunity to introduce to you Senator Simon Birmingham. Simon is the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, as well as the Leader of the Opposition in the Australian Senate. He's been a Senator for South Australia since 2007, having received an MBA prior to his entering into politics, and worked in a number of industry bodies, establishing particular expertise and has experience in wine, tourism, and the hospitality sectors. After a very short 3 years, Simon was appointed to the Shadow Ministry, serving as Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for the Murray-Darling Basin and the Environment until 2013. The elections won that election in 2013, and Simon served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for the Environment for about 12 months. In 2014, Simon was appointed to serve as the Assistant Minister for Education and Training in the Abbott Ministry, followed by his appointment as the Minister for Education and Training in the Turnbull government in 2015. And ultimately, he was made a Manager of Government Business in the Senate in February 2018. So under the Morrison government, Simon was appointed as Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, as well as Deputy Leader of the government in the Senate in August 2018. In 2020, Simon was appointed as Minister for Finance, whilst also having the responsibility as the Leader of the government in the Senate. After the 2022 federal elections, Simon was appointed as the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, as I've noted, as well as his current position as the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. So with all the many hats that Simon has been juggling and all the hard work that he's been doing, we thank him for being here today. Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Faraz, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you and to speak with members of the Iranian community in Australia and worldwide yet again. We share your disappointment, but equally share in you being unsurprised at the fact that your compatriots, your friends and supporters in Iran are unable to join us today. And of course, that is so emblematic of the type of suppression and repression that far too many Iranians face in far too many circumstances. In speaking with everyone here today, my mind firstly goes back to 16 September 2022. 16 September 2022 was the date that Mahsa Jina Amini was killed and died in Iran. And of course, her death was not the first, a long way from it. Many atrocities had been committed before, and tragically, many have been committed since. But it was indeed the beginning and sparking of a movement for which so many of those on this call should be proud of the courage, the determination, the bravery that people have shown in the way in which they have been willing to stand up and to call out the horrors of the Iranian regime. And I have been pleased to see the way in which so many have stood with you during that time. You'll hear shortly from my colleague, Senator Claire Chandler, a fellow Liberal Senator, the Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, but most importantly, Claire in chairing the work of our Senate inquiry, looking at the way in which we can strengthen Australia's response to the horrors and evils of the Iranian regime is such a commendable piece of work and provides such clear direction that we are eager and committed as an opposition in Australia to seeing pursued, but particularly eager to see our government pursued. We've just heard from my colleague Tim Watts, the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, and I acknowledge the things that Tim says the government is doing. We've given full and bipartisan support to steps such as the sanctions that have been undertaken. We would wish that those sanctions were implemented faster, quicker, and indeed we've initiated a Senate inquiry that is underway at present and that I encourage people to participate in, looking at the effectiveness of our sanctions regime to ensure that where we are applying sanctions, they have maximum impact. They are applied as quickly and comprehensively as possible across the board with like-minded nations, and that where we can, there are implications from those sanctions, including the consideration of asset seizures or other steps that can really give them the maximum possible teeth. And whilst we welcome that application of sanctions, though, there is more that we do believe should occur. For when we look at present of the totality of destruction and horror that Iran is wreaking, it does so not just upon its own people, the regime and the way it suppresses and oppresses and inflicts horror on women, girls, dissidents, freedom fighters, others who stand for their beliefs, but also, of course, the way in which it now works across a network of terrorist organisations seeking to cause and inflict massive disruption. The work of those terror groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, sponsored, coordinated, funded by Iran through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the IRGC, through its sponsorship of these organisations and its direct undertakings and support of other terrorist actions around the world, we believe does warrant recognition and listing as a terrorist organisation. We have been clear about the need for that, and we will continue to push. And if it is not possible to do so under the current Australian laws, then we have been clear that we would give bipartisan support to the government to change the Australian laws to enable those steps to be undertaken. We welcome the fact that Canada did so. It provides a good, strong, clear example of what can and should be done, and we look forward to hearing from our colleague there in relation to the work of Canada. It's also important that we do take the steps to ensure that Iran has minimum opportunity to spread its hate into countries like our own. That's why I echo the words of Tim in relation to encouraging the community to make sure that if they ever feel pressure, suspicion of pressure, surveillance or the like from Iranian authorities whilst living, working in a country like Australia, they should report that to our authorities. But we also need to take steps to ensure that the leadership of Iran are limited from their ability within Australia and countries like us to promote that hatred and to undertake those activities. And we have seen multiple instances now, including just in the last week, of Iran's ambassador to Australia engaging in hate speech, undertaking statements that, were they to be said by an individual speaking at a rally in Australia or a preacher speaking in a place of worship, then they may well actually instigate legal proceedings against them by virtue of breaking the laws in relation to the type of statements that are being made, the insightful statements that are being made, the support for terrorism. But of course, these are statements being made by Iran's ambassador to Australia, who enjoys the diplomatic immunities of his status and privileges. And whilst that may prevent him from being charged, it does warrant the case and necessitate why we believe he should have withdrawn that diplomatic right within Australia, that he should be declared persona non grata under the conventions available to the government, and that in doing so, he should be packing his bags back to Tehran. We should not be tolerating the spread of such hatred and viciousness and divisiveness within our country, and we should be making and setting the example in relation to that behaviour. I know also that we have pursued, and Claire in particular pursued, some outstanding work in terms of arguing the case publicly to limit Iran's leadership roles in international fora, particularly in those fora where it is so hypocritical for the Iranian regime to be sitting there providing their views on human rights, on the rights of women, or things that are completely contrary and anathema to the way in which they work. And we will continue to argue that case in those causes. So I do wish to say for us, to you, to all of those who have joined us today, that you have our full support. We are also eager to understand what else the community wishes to see, how we can most effectively continue to stand by you, that we indeed never forget Mahsa Jina Amini's name, nor the fight and sacrifice of so many others for freedom within Iran, and the strong values that so many of you have brought to the way in which you call out not just the IRGC and Iran's suppression within your country, but the evil way in which they are causing that disruption elsewhere and inflicting harm elsewhere that has caused so many thousands of people to lose their lives and face such suffering. And that is why we must be so consistent in relation to identifying Iran's role in that destruction and to seeking to hold them to account. I look forward to the rest of the panel engagement.
Many thanks, Simon, for those timely remarks. And 2 points that I'll just highlight now. One is the upcoming Senate inquiry into the effectiveness of the sanctions regime and what we can do. We'll certainly bring that up. And also the very important matter that you highlighted, Simon, namely the Iranian ambassador's tweet, which became a hot topic some weeks ago. But we'll come back to that, and I suspect there'll be a whole range of questions on those two. Can I now take the opportunity to invite our Canadian guest joining us from Ottawa? I'm told that he's skipping dinner to be with us tonight, so thank you very much, Ali. Ali Essasi is the current member of the House of Commons in Canada and the Liberal member for Willowdale. He is the chair of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, as well as chair and a member of a number of other parliamentary committees. I think I counted 5 in total, but I decided not to set them all out. Ali was born in Geneva, raised between New York and Tehran, and finally moved to Ontario, Canada at the age of 15 following the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. He initially took arts at university for undergrad, followed by a Master of Science at LSE in London. After completing that, he took law at York University, followed by a Master's in International Trade and Arbitration at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Ali was elected some 9 years ago to Parliament. In fact, I think the anniversary of his election is coming up, the 19th of October. So it'll be 9 years in about 15 days. And he's been a full-time member of Parliament ever since then. Over the course of his political career, Ali has never abandoned his heritage, his Iranian heritage, as well as the plight of the people in Iran. He's publicly condemned the Islamic Republic's human rights abuses and has urged Canada to refrain from supporting the regime's terrorist agenda, as well as all the nefarious acts and activities. with regards to the ongoing protest in Iran, even though they may have been somewhat quietened down in the last little while, Ali has been an outspoken supporter of the Iranian people and central to Canada's response. We'll hear from Ali on a number of topics, but can I also finish his introduction by saying this, that Ali is the member of the government that ultimately decided to list the IRGC as a terror entity under Canadian legislative framework. And we'll no doubt hear from him about that, and no doubt questions will be put to him. But for now, I'll hand over to Ali. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Faraz, for that incredibly gracious and fulsome introduction. I can truly tell you no one has taken that much time to introduce me. So very grateful for that. But also thank you for convening today's event. That's obviously occurring just after the second anniversary of the death of Mahsa Jina Amini, and of course the birth of the Women Life Freedom Movement of Iran. Thank you to everyone who is connected tonight, who has been at the forefront of advocating for the international community to adopt a robust response to developments in Iran. I should acknowledge, as much as you did for us, that the repression in Iran, unfortunately, is ongoing. So we haven't seen that abate in the least bit. But in particular, let me thank you, Faraz, for your tireless efforts and the efforts of the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists, as well as thank Ms. Parto and the international community of Iranian academics for your truly stellar and tremendous and sustained advocacy during these difficult times. I also, if I may, I apologize for this, wanted to thank my good and indefatigable friend, Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who I understand is in the audience today, for her steadfast commitment and leadership. It's indeed a great honor and pleasure for me to join such a distinguished panel in Australia this evening. Allow me to commence by saying that the clarion call for the action that came from Iranians 2 years ago came when they participated in historic protests that gripped well over 100 cities scattered across the country. Their demands were ours to embrace, echo, and amplify. Witnessing the suffocating hardships endured by Iranians certainly flickered daily on our social media feeds or was plastered on the front pages of our newspapers. And indeed, it was very difficult to be a witness to it all. The many displays of courage and defiance that emerged from Iran confirmed essentially that the vast majority of Iranians, by some estimates I would add, 80% of the population in that country demands nothing really less than the demise of the Iranian regime. And the reasons for that are countless. But for one, the impunity of the Iranian regime is certainly second to none. Iran's decision several days ago to rain down missiles on Israel was another sober reminder of the dangers and the menace that the Islamic Republic poses to the values our two countries cherish in the international community. But as I understand, the focus of today's discussion is on the Iranian regime's capacity for oppressing its own people and the best means by which democratic countries can hold it to account. Imagine, if you will, that during the height of the Women Life Freedom Movement, the Iranian regime killed well over 500 protesters and incarcerated over 22,000 individuals. These actions certainly awoke many of us to our responsibilities as individuals and countries more clearly than had ever previously been the case. What other country, as I like to remind people, continues to imprison a Nobel laureate Nargis Mohammadi, ensures that all the country's leading lawyers, such as Nasrin Sotoudeh, languish under the burden of decades-long sentences, and also defiantly silences the country's most popular musicians, such as Tumaj and Shervin Hajipur. Protests in our respective countries and indeed around the world were certainly crucial to ensuring that momentum was maintained, that our countries did not turn a blind eye, and that ultimately the courageous people of Iran were supported. I would add and underscore that in Canada, and this was alluded to, the downing of PS 752 was still fresh in Canadian minds. While in Australia, I would say that the issue of arbitrarily detaining Australians, such as Dr. Maury Gilbert, certainly left an imprimatur on your collective psyche. Other countries, no doubt, have their own individual experiences and collective memories of the Iranian regime's atrocities to draw on. As such, the diplomatic support that occurred in various multilateral fora to hold the Iranian regime to account was particularly impressive. The international community removed representatives of the Iranian regime from the Committee on the Status of Women at the UN in New York and established a UN fact-finding mission in Geneva, where concrete examples of action by the Iranian regime have been cataloged. I can say that I was there in person in New York when Iran was kicked off the Committee on the Status of Women. And as the son of Iran's former permanent representative to the UN in New York in the 1970s, it certainly gave me great pleasure to witness it in person. It was also, I should add, on that particular day that I met another participant in tonight's event, Mr. Ali Rahnama, a distinguished lawyer in the United States who's on our call and who actually facilitated my presence before you today. And allow me to say that a very special thank you is owed to Australia for having been an integral part of those two significant diplomatic initiatives. Your country put its shoulders to the diplomatic wheel. Not for the first time in our history, both Canada and Australia fought shoulder to shoulder to make such achievements, diplomatic achievements, that possible in multilateral fora. But allow me to also indulge your impatience and summarize actions Canada has adopted in our domestic sphere to signal that it supported the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. Since 2007, Canada had imposed sanctions on Iranian officials, military leaders, and organizations. This process began under the United Nations sanctions on the Iranian nuclear program. But since we have worked in a very different direction, and that sanctions that we have adopted have been pursuant to legislation, which is referred to as the Special Economic Measures Act. These sanctions prevent Canadians from working with or trading with listed entities. The first pillar of Canada's response to the Women Life Freedom movement was the imposition of further sanctions. Since the killing of Mahsa Amini, Canada has introduced 17 rounds of sanctions against Iranian officials and entities. As such, currently 205 Iranian individuals and 250 Iranian entities have been sanctioned. All these sanctions, I can assure you, have been considered and coordinated with our allies, most notably, I would say, the United States, and yes, indeed, Australia as well. The second significant pillar of Canada's response was to bar Iranian officials from entering our country. On November 14th, 2022, Canada announced that pursuant to subparagraph 35(1)(b) of our Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, anyone who had served as a senior official in the Iranian government since 2019 would be denied entry in Canada. This measure alone is estimated to have barred up to 10,000 Iranian officials from entry to Canada. And with respect to barring high-ranking officials, we just announced last month, when marking the second anniversary of the Women Like Freedom movement, that the start date of our measures affecting senior Iranian government officials would move back to 2003. So we moved the goalpost from 2019 to 2003. The significance, for those of you who may not be familiar, the significance of 2003 was that it represented the year in which the Iranian government detained and killed the late Ms. Zahra Kazemi, an Iranian-Canadian photojournalist that had visited Iran. Therefore, under the IRPA, as we refer to it, not only are new entrants banned, but any current or former high-ranking Iranian official in Canada could lose their immigration status that they may have obtained and be subject to deportation. Finally, the third pillar of the Canadian response has been the addition of the IRGC as a terrorist entity under our criminal code. This past June, we announced that Canada would add the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to our list of recognized terrorist groups under the criminal code. This has given our security agencies additional powers to tackle the threat posed by the IRGC and any individual determined to have acted in concert with the organization. The listing immediately froze any identified assets within Canada. And it is now, of course, a criminal offense for any individual within Canada or abroad to deal with property owned or controlled by the IRGC. Similarly, materially supporting the IRGC can be prosecuted criminally. So that, in summary, is truly the actions that we have taken in the last 2 years. But I certainly look very much forward to any questions you may have.
Many thanks, Ali, for the insightful summary of the Canadian government's actions and the Trudeau government's steps taken, and the tiered steps taken, and what I will refer to as the elevation and the ultimate reaching to the top of the ladder of the designation question. And I suspect there will be many questions coming fast and very hot on that topic. Can I introduce to you a person that doesn't need an introduction to the Iranian Australian community here, Senator Claire Chandler, a constant and reliable friend of the Iranian Australian community. That's the title of my introduction for Claire. Claire is a Liberal senator for Tasmania, having held that position since July 2019. She served as Deputy Government Whip in the Senate and chair of the Finance and the Public Administration Legislation Committee. She has lived and worked in Tasmania all her life, and she received her arts and law degrees, both from the University of Tasmania, and worked in Hobart prior to joining Parliament. In the 47th Parliament, Claire was appointed to the Shadow Ministry and currently serves as the Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, and also chairs the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee. That's the committee that held the inquiry on Iran and whose report was published about a year ago, if I'm not mistaken. At the time of her election, Claire was the youngest member of the Morrison government. She was also Australia's youngest currently serving female senator, as I understand. Now, Claire has championed the rights of women and the girls in Iran. She has chaired the Senate inquiry that I talked about, and she continues to advocate for a stronger response to the the Australian government, or by the Australian government, in relation to Iran, its regime, and the oppressive acts specifically by the IRGC, but also in relation to the oppressive acts against women, girls, religious and other minorities in Iran. So a tireless and determined operator, regardless which angle you consider her accomplishments. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Faraz, and thank you to you and Nagar for facilitating this conversation here today. And thank you for making time for me on short notice as well. I was originally meant to be travelling to Israel today for the 7th of October anniversary commemorations, but perhaps not surprisingly, given the escalation in the conflict there over the last few days, that trip has sadly been postponed. I've spoken at a few of these various forums with members of the Iranian community, both here and overseas, over the last few weeks, as we have commemorated the anniversary of Mahsa Jina Amini's death and the Women Life Freedom movement. And reflecting over that last 2 years, it's been quite poignant to think that in September 2022, I think it was not entirely foreseeable that we were going to end up where we now are. And I think it's really important to remember that, because the Women Life Freedom movement has been a revolution that's been driven by the Iranian people, and particularly by Iranian women and girls. And to think 2 years ago, that the warning bells were being sounded on the influence of the IRI regime, and now looking at the level of conflict that we are experiencing in the Middle East, I think it's really important to reflect on how far we've come, on how much destruction and violence the regime has been able to inflict both upon its own people and on the region more broadly. And it's really timely for us to consider how we as Australians, as any Western nations, can be doing more to hold the Iranian regime, the IRI regime, I should say, to account. 2 years ago, we were seeing significant rallies, protests, advocacy groups coming together around this country to signify and raise awareness of the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. And I think it's important to note that that is one of the reasons why the Australian Senate unanimously agreed to undertake the Iran inquiry that's been mentioned a couple of times today, that I had the pleasure of chairing as the chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee. The diaspora here in Australia has been absolutely steadfast in their advocacy to all elected representatives, but particularly to the government, of what they want to see in terms of holding the IRI regime to account. And my colleague, Senator Birmingham, went through many of those recommendations that we came up with during the inquiry process. And they are recommendations that have been the requests of the Iranian diaspora and have been echoed time and time again over the last 2 years. And they include listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, minimising the relationship that Australia has with the IRI regime to the greatest extent possible, dedicating more government resources to tackle the foreign interference and concerns that exist within the diaspora. We know here in Australia that members of the diaspora feel that they are being harassed and intimidated and watched when they attend protests, or even just when they're going about their everyday lives. And frankly, that's not the sort of behaviour that we would tolerate if it were an Australian citizen undertaking that sort of thing against one of our own. So we shouldn't tolerate it when there are concerns that it's a foreign individual or a foreign entity undertaking that sort of surveillance as well. The inquiry also touched on the issue of hostage diplomacy. And I think Faraz mentioned that we have Kylie Moore-Gilbert here on the call today, and obviously Kylie presented to that inquiry. That has spurred a further Senate inquiry that is currently underway into the wrongful detention of Australians overseas, looking at how the framework to deal with wrongfully detained Australians can be strengthened, and how we can best send a message that the practice of hostage diplomacy is absolutely heinous. And we know that the IRI regime, sadly, is a regime that engages in that practice far too often. So we need to be considering whether there is more that our government can be doing to try and deter that practice from occurring. In conclusion, I don't want to take up too much time because we've already heard from so many great panelists here today. But again, thinking back over the last 2 years and the role that the IRI regime is currently playing in destabilising, frankly, the global geostrategic environment, but also specifically in the Middle East as well. I think it's really important that we don't forget about the plight of the Iranian people. And if there is one thing that I've heard from the Iranian diaspora here and from various stakeholders over the last 12 months or so, it's that we cannot forget that while we know Iran is playing a significant role destabilising in the Middle East, obviously, their attacks on Israel in the last couple of days have been completely abhorrent. We cannot forget the fact that there are millions and millions of people living in Iran who are currently being oppressed by the IRI regime. We know that the regime has a terrible track record when it comes to protecting the human rights of its own citizens. That's why the Senate undertook an inquiry 2 years ago that came up with a series of recommendations for us to hold that regime to account. That need to hold that regime to account for what it is doing to its own citizens is just as great now as it was 2 years ago. So I certainly hope that our government here doesn't forget that, and that no Western government forgets that, because obviously the conflict in the Middle East is of great concern to all of us, but the plight of the Iranians is of great concern to me as well. So I'll leave it there, but thanks very much Faraz again for organising today.
And thank you, Claire. Well, I'll highlight it once again, although I did the same at the end of Simon's little summary. Can I say this? The Senate will be looking at this question about the sufficiency and the mechanisms of the sanctions regime, what needs to be done and otherwise. So for those of you in the audience from Australia who have both the desire and, I suppose, the willingness to assist and chip in, so to speak, get involved. We will be sure to get you the information, and I suspect we'll talk about it on the panel today. But enough about that. Can I start with the questions? Tim, can I perhaps put the first question to you? And the question, I'm told, comes from Kylie Moore-Gilbert, and I suspect, I'm told, she's happy for me to name the questioner. The question put, Tim, is this: that you rightly laud the government's achievements in slapping the additional sanctions on the Islamic Republic officials and institutions. And no doubt, from the perspective of the Iranian diaspora, that is a very positive step. The question put is, will the government sanction any of the Iranian officials for the crime of the hostage-taking of multiple Australian citizens?
Thank you, Faraz, and thank you, Kylie, for that question. Let me begin by acknowledging both your experience with the Iranian regime and your continued advocacy, not just in your own personal circumstances, but for the broader cause. I fully appreciate where your question is coming from. It's a difficult one for me to answer in the context of being a portfolio minister. It's difficult for me to speculate, about future potential sanction activities. We don't speculate about anything that we may or may not do in the future for a range of very good practical reasons. But let me just say broadly, the Australian government imposes Australian autonomous sanctions where it's in our national interest to do so. With respect to Iran, we've been consistent, proactive and assertive in holding the Iranian regime to account for its gross violations of human rights. So we don't speculate on potential sanction measures, but I can assure you that we continue to deliberately and strategically work with partners to apply pressure on the Iranian regime. I won't go over again the broad range of sanctions activity we've had in Iran with respect to Iran, but it's worth highlighting that, in addition to sanctions activity addressing the oppression of women and girls in Iran and the general oppression of people in Iran, we've also pursued autonomous sanctions for undermining of good governance and the rule of law in Iran, as well as sanctioning senior law enforcement and security officials that have been complicit in Iran's violent repression of protests. So you can see that the context that we're operating in and the deliberate strategic approach that we are taking. But yeah, speculating on potential sanctions measures in specific instances isn't something that I'm able to do as a portfolio minister.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank
Can
you.
I ask Negar to ask the next question and put it to the panel?
Oh, thank you, Faraz. Tim, this is also for you. So this comes from a media reporter from Iran International TV, Mr. Ali Reza Mohebbi, and he's asking, despite the condemnation of Australia's foreign minister of showing support for a terrorist organization like Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic's ambassador in Australia praised Hassan Nasrallah as an outstanding standard bearer in his Twitter account. The coalition has called for the Albanese government to declare the Iranian ambassador's persona non grata after praising the slain leader of Hezbollah. In your speech, you said that the current Australian government tried to hold the Islamic Republic accountable, but even the ambassador of the Islamic Republic doesn't pay attention to the warnings and ignores your condemnation. Has the current government of Australia adopted a policy of appeasement towards the Islamic Republic? And why the actions of Australian government towards the Islamic Republic have not changed the behavior of the Islamic Republic and its ambassador in Australia? Thank you.
Look, can I start by saying that no Australian government has taken harsher action on Iran than the current Australian government. That's a statement of fact. So I just utterly reject the pejorative rhetoric in that question. Let me say, with respect to the comments of the Iranian ambassador, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have made clear that the Australian government condemns any support for terrorist organisations such as Hezbollah, and we condemn the ambassador's repugnant comments. Australia has maintained a diplomatic relationship with Iran continuously since 1968, not because we agree, but because it's in our national interest to do so. And in all of that time, the diplomatic relationship between our countries has never been an endorsement of that regime. It's a channel to protect Australia's interests and to communicate the views of Australia and our close partners. We've used that channel to make clear our utter condemnation for comments like that, and that has been made clear in Canberra and in Tehran. But it's also a channel that we've used to express our expectations about Iran's destabilising activities across the Middle East. Now, whether we like it or not, Iran remains a significant actor in the region. This is a region that is on the brink of regional conflict, and it is important that we are using all channels available to us to communicate our expectations for de-escalation of that conflict. If conflict continues, and if the indiscriminate and irresponsible missile attacks launched by Iran are able to continue, it's civilians who'll pay the price for that. Civilians across the region. And as I said earlier, in conflicts like this we've seen, it's women and children that pay the price for this. So we have a diplomatic relationship with Iran, not because we agree, but because the channel for us to advocate our Australian government's position on these very difficult issues.
Thank
Thank
you,
you very
Tim.
much. Can I pose a question to all members of the panels, and then I leave it to Faraz for the next question? The question came about Australians' actions towards the assets of the officials or their relatives in Australia and maybe in Canada, if you could refer. So, what Australia and Canada could do regarding this question is about Gellibrand, the assets of Gellibrand family in Melbourne. As the chair of the Iranian parliament. So would any member of the panel would like to start?
If you like, I can take that first. Well, what I can inform you that that approximately a year ago, and I'm not quite sure whether this is the same Mr. Gellibrand that has also lived in Australia, because I understand there was one who did. But in Canada, it came to light that the son of Mr. Gellibrand had actually been waiting for his permanent residency card, but the action from our government was quite swift. And the reason this came to light was that Mr. Gellibrand, having been denied his permanent residency card because it was going through national security background check, which can go on indefinitely, he evidently was not happy with that. He brought action before the federal court to say that his rights had been abridged, but once that came to light, reaction by our government was swift, and it was denied.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answer. Would any of our panel members would like to comment about Australia? Faraz, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, good. It's appreciated that commenting on specific cases are difficult, but I think one of the aspects of concern for the Iranian diaspora, whether the Iranian Australian community or the Iranian Canadian community, is that members of families of persons sanctioned are freely roaming the West. And whilst specific actors within the despotic regime may be sanctioned in many cases, and we won't go into the details or specifics of them, they are freely roaming, buying property, going to university, and doing all sorts of other good things that we enjoy here without any repercussions. Which brings me to this question for Ali. It took at least some 2 years of effort, if I can call it, or lack of a better word, and push and lobbying for the Canadian government to designate the IRGC. Now, whilst I won't ask you about the internal mechanics and how it ultimately ended up happening, because I think the audience might fall asleep if I ask that question, the question put is this: what is, from a practical perspective, the difference between sanctioning a particular person, entity, or persons, or in this particular case, the designation of the IRGC, and why was it that Canada ultimately made the decision to designate as opposed to impose more sanctions?
So thank you for that question. What I can tell you is that it was a sustained effort. There was a long-standing campaign for this to happen. Obviously, given the numerous protests that were taking place across Canada, that very much assisted in this effort. So the demand was very loud and clear, if you will. But as you can imagine, a measure such as that, first of all, the criminal code can be a very complicated thing to navigate. And as you know full well, Faraz, you will get different legal opinions from different lawyers. So that certainly wasn't particularly helpful. But ultimately, I think what's very important to bear in mind is that an issue such as that falls within the jurisdiction of several different departments. So to the extent that I was privy to those discussions, on occasion, one department would be in favor, another one not so much. And given the numerous things that are going on in the realm of foreign affairs, getting those various departments aligned and on board could be a difficult task. So that essentially was the backdrop to it, because it is a complicated question. It's a question that people will disagree on as to what the scope of such action will be, what the reaction may possibly be from the Iranian regime. So there was a lot of robust discussion, and perspectives did differ. But thank goodness, ultimately, that decision was made. I think currently there were 5 countries that have listed the IRGC. And in my opinion, as we watch the backdrop of developments and we see autocratic regimes actually working together, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, it's also important that we all work together as well. Because as the saying goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if there was more of an interest in other countries to also do so, I think it would elevate everybody's security. And as countries such as Canada and Australia are fully aware, we cooperate on the full gamut of issues. We're both members of the Five Eyes, so I'm certain that there has been a lot of coordination that's gone on, and I alluded to that when it comes to sanctions. But perhaps it would be nice to see that extended to the issue of listing the IRGC as well.
Thank you, Ali. Tim, on the back of that, can I ask you this question? The government's position is, and I understand that the legal aspects are not necessarily within your portfolio, your department, I should say, but the Attorney General has made it clear through his office that the difficulty in listing the IRGC as a terror entity is that the law doesn't allow it currently. But to complement the very good work and the very good efforts of the government today in relation to the Iranian regime and the nefarious acts, as well as the sanctions and ongoing sanctions, which we both appreciate and we applaud you for, if the legal blockade, if the legal issue was sorted, would the government list the IRGC as a terror entity?
Thank you, Faraz. I was reflecting, listening to Ali Asahi's comments on this issue, his answer on this issue, that saying, there are people will come to different conclusions, take different approaches on specifics here. The one thing that no one comes to different conclusions about or takes a different approach in is the assessment that the IRGC is a malign actor that has long been a threat to international security. And specifically to the people of Iran. That's why we have been using all of the available tools to us to take meaningful action against the IRGC. I've talked about the 100 individuals and organisations related to the IRGC who we've sanctioned. and also talked about former Prime Minister Gillard's government sanctioning the IRGC as a whole since 2010. I should also say that there are other areas of action and international cooperation with respect to preventing foreign interference, through Home Affairs, through ASIO. So if we have a difference on one specific issue, and I can understand very much people's desire to look for every potential opportunity to do something, but let me underline that we agree that the IRGC is a malign actor, and that's a threat to international security and the people to Iran. I should say that there are different legal frameworks between Australia and Canada. The other thing that I would point out is that Canada, like the United States, does not have an embassy in Iran. That is another difference between us, and I've articulated the reasons that Australia maintains that diplomatic presence and the way that we use it to advocate for the positions of our government, to send our messages about Iran's behaviour in the region, and also to advocate for Australians who come into difficulty in Iran, and to advocate for consular cases. So there is a broader context here as well that's important to appreciate.
Thank you, Tim. And I think for the benefit of the audience, it is important to appreciate that there is a market difference between the Canadian landscape and that in Australia. And as Tim has pointed out, we still have an ongoing relationship, an embassy. We have people on the ground there. And without saying much more, I think everybody understands that there are different moving parts at play when it comes to Australia's decision on this question. But Simon, can I perhaps ask you a question? Is Simon online? No?
Faraz, I think he's jumped off, so I'm happy to field whatever you had planned for Senator Birmingham.
Thank you. And I think Claire has already noted one of the reasons that Claire's name and photo and details was not on the poster was that Claire was initially unable to join this session. As she noted, she was due to be in Israel for commemorating the 7th of October attack on Israel. And for obvious reasons, she's here with us today. So thank you, Claire, for being here. I'll put this question to you. You've heard what Tim has said about the multi-layered concerns, one, and the multi-layered approaches that the government has already taken to dealing with the malign behavior of the IRGC and the Islamic Republic as a whole. And some of the reasons why the IRGC has not yet been listed. The question put, again, it comes from Kylie Moore-Gilbert. Will the coalition commit to prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation if and when it wins government?
Thank you, Kylie, for that question, and thank you, Faraz, for reading it out to me. The short answer is yes. We will list the IRGC if we were elected as the next Australian government. And the long answer is we will list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation because that is what they are, and that is how Australia should be appropriately dealing with them. And I take the points that have been made about the different legal frameworks that might exist between Australia, in terms of Australia and other jurisdictions. But as my colleague Senator Birmingham said, we have offered bipartisan support to the government to make whatever changes are required, either at a legislative or policy level, to enable the IRGC to be listed as a terrorist organisation. It's also important to note, because much of my work over the last 18 months or so has been in this area, that we know that the Department of Home Affairs, the Australian government department responsible for listing terrorist organisations, or more accurately, I should say, for making recommendations to its minister to list a terrorist organisation, did have a process underway in January 2023 to list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. We know that department was compiling the documentation, compiling the evidence to make that consideration of a listing. This was a couple of weeks before the Senate inquiry tabled its report in the Senate. And the day before we were due to make that report public, to table it in the Senate, we received a last-minute submission, not from the Department of Home Affairs, not from the Department of Foreign Affairs, but from the Attorney General's Department, suddenly providing this legal advice that specified that apparently the IRGC could not be listed under the current legislative regime that's in place here in Australia. So we have offered to assist the government in changing that legislation if required, because we think it's frankly ridiculous that the IRGC hasn't been listed up until this point. So many of our allies have done it. We should be doing it. It is what Australians want, and it is particularly what the Iranian diaspora wants. And like I say, the IRGC does engage in terrorist activity, and we should designate them as such.
Thank you, Claire. I don't think we can get a clearer answer than that. This question has come up a number of times, and it seems that the coalition's position is pretty clear on that. So you don't continuously hear my voice, can I invite Negar to ask the next question, please?
Thank you. One of the issues that comes up quite a lot is about, and Claire, I would like you to comment on it too, about the next step, or what can we do? So if the Islamic Republic doesn't respond to condemnation, doesn't respond to warning, doesn't respond to diplomacy, or even at case sanctions, what would be the next step? How would Australia government and Canada government, if Ali would like to comment, how would they respond? And I know we are running out of time, so I really appreciate you all answer these questions the best time that you have. Would you like to start? Yeah.
Of course. Thank you, Negar. Look, from my perspective, listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation is the next step that we should be taking. It was the first step that we should have been taking many, many months ago, but we know that hasn't occurred yet. And I also think we need to be looking at that diplomatic relationship that we maintain with the IRI regime and consider whether it's appropriate for the Iranian ambassador to continue being able to stay in this country, given some of the disgraceful things that he has been saying publicly. And part of my concern that has only worsened over the last couple of years is I'm not convinced that the way that the West has dealt with Iran, generally speaking, that's not just Australia, that's our allies as well, has had any deterring factor in terms of Iran's behaviour. And we talk about the importance of having diplomatic conversations and the importance of condemnation. And I accept that there is a time and a place for that, but doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of madness. And we look at the way that the West has sort of tried to gently, quietly send messages to the IRI regime in a situation where they have escalated the conflict in the Middle East to the level that they have, that they are undertaking foreign interference in our country the way that the government has publicly attributed they have. I think we have to ask the question whether what we're doing is actually working, and that's why we need to be doing more to hold the regime to account. I think the time for conversations is over. It's frankly time for actions, and like I say, grounding or making the ambassador in Australia persona non grata and listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation are two really good places to start.
Thank you very much, Claire. Tim, would you like to comment on the question?
Look, I appreciate we're running out of time, but let me just make a few things really clear. We haven't taken a gently, softly approach to Iran in any respect. There has never been stronger action taken by an Australian government against the Iranian regime than this government. I don't like to politicize these things, but there was no sanction activity under the previous government that Claire's party represents. If listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation is the first step someone should take, they were in government 2 years ago. They could have done that then. They didn't. Now, the approach that we are taking is from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister down. We have been utterly clear and direct in our public communications, in our private communications. Condemnation for Iran's destabilising role in the region and its repugnant human rights record. We've worked closely with partner countries, particularly like Canada, but other like-minded countries, to make our position clear in multilateral forums and to maximise the pressure on Iran in those kinds of forums. And we've also used our bilateral voice directly with the ambassador, with the Iranian foreign minister, in making our expectations very, very clear to the Iranian government. But there's been nothing quiet, there's been nothing soft, there's been nothing gentle about the way that we have communicated with this regime.
Thank you very much. Annie, would you like to comment about, in general, what steps could we take in the West?
I don't presume to know exactly what steps would be most effective. I'll put that out there as the first thing. And the premise of your question was, what if these measures don't work? I'm not exactly sure if that's the right framework for us to use as to what measures are necessary. And I say this because this has been a regime that for 45 years has really been impervious to being rational on the international stage, or acting in a manner that would elevate the country's own self-interest. So all of our respective countries could be going about it in a determined fashion, but that does not necessarily mean that the regime in Iran will respond in the manner that we would all like to see it respond. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, I think we all have to accept the reality that that these are difficult decisions. They really are, and for that reason, I wanted to thank Senator Chandler for the report that her committee did. In that report, what we did see were numerous instances in which the Iranian regime is harassing members in Australia. So that in and of itself goes to tell you how little respect the Iranian regime has for norms that are pretty commonplace in our societies. But a lot of times, and this is a fraught topic, but a lot of times it's not just about simply trying to alter the Iranian regime's malicious behavior. It's also about trying to elevate the security and the safety of our own citizens. So these are all very, very difficult decisions to make. We can look at the United Kingdom as well. This is one of those issues that they've been wrestling. But other than that, I would say that the amount of cooperation that we have seen between our respective countries has truly been exemplary. And that's something that we should all bear in mind.
Thank you for your answer. Faraz?
Thank you. This is a question for Tim. Sorry, Tim, they keep coming to you. We've already heard, I think Tim is there. His camera is off. Tim, can you hear me?
Sorry, Faraz, I think I've got another meeting backing up on me here.
Sure, sorry. We'll end it with this. We've heard the government's position and what you said the government has done, and also the multi-layered approach required to any question, sanctions, designation, etc. The first part of the question is this: is Australia currently in discussions with other nation states on the question of designation, one? And two, if obviously you may not be able to comment on that specifically, will Australia engage on the question of designation with its partners, that is namely the designation of the IRGC?
Look, that's a decision for the Australian government. But more broadly, we seek to work with like-minded countries to maximise pressure on the Iranian regime, and you've seen the way we've done that to date. We've acted jointly in so far as possible, recognising our different sanctions frameworks on sanctioning activities. And we've announced those at the same time to maximise their impact, to maximise the leverage of a joint voice from the United community, from the international community with respect to Iran. So we certainly look to work with partners to maximise pressure on the Iranian regime, but that specific policy issue that you raise is a question for the Australian government that we would deal with ourselves. And as I say, I've articulated our position on that.
Sorry, Ali.
Sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, no, I was saying thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. Ali, on the back of that question, and perhaps we'll make this the last one given everyone's commitments. Was there a degree, understanding that the question is a domestic question to be dealt with within the framework of the national legislation, but did Canada liaise and coordinate, if you can comment on it, with its partners, international partners, prior to designating the IRGC?
To be very, very frank with you, I'm not exactly sure what those discussions may have been. I wasn't privy to those, but I really do mean this. Your ambassador in Canada is an incredibly sophisticated ambassador who comes at it with a wealth of experience. And I've actually had the benefit of discussing issues with her. So I would assume my job as a parliamentarian isn't to be privy to those discussions, but I would assume very much so that there is quite a bit of consultation that is taking place. I know that I've spoken to Australian parliamentarians. I've also spoken to British parliamentarians about measures that may prove effective, but ultimately as to whether our respective governments are doing it in a coordinated fashion, I'm not certain. But I do know that with respect to a whole host of issues, and I acknowledge the fact that our Sanctions Bureau actually works very, very closely with your Sanctions Bureau. And you have certain strengths, and we have certain strengths. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight. With respect to, let's say, a whole host of other issues, whether it's the Middle East, our respective countries have adopted very, very similar positions. And we have made announcements, the three of us combined with New Zealand, with respect to Russia and the situation in Ukraine. The same has been true. So I would assume that there are very significant high-level discussions that do take place.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ali. Given the time commitments of all our busy panelists, we might leave it there. And can I just finish by thanking everybody for being here. Tim, Ali, Claire, and Simon, your time is valuable. Your input is even more valuable in the eyes of the Iranian diaspora. And everything that's been said today has been done in a friendly fashion in order to continue the dialogue and to continue to expand the connection between the Iranian Australian and the Iranian Canadian communities and their representatives. So my heartfelt gratitude to all of you. Secondly, the NAIJ and ICOIA, we have a series of these online roundtables. Following this, we'll be announcing a similar one with the European parliamentarians, the United Kingdom, and then ultimately a third session in the early part of next year. So keep an eye out for that. And Claire and Simon noted, this is for the Australians in the room. the Senate inquiry into Australia's sanctions regime. So please get in touch with us if you need further information, or if you just Google the Australia's sanctions regime inquiry, the Senate's inquiry, you'll get more information. So please make submission, please get involved. And once again, thank you to each and every one of you, including our audience. Thank you.
I also want to thank on behalf of ICOIA and on behalf of NAIJ, thanks everyone who coordinated this, made the posters, worked tirelessly in the back to make sure that this event happened. We really look forward to continue. Tim and Claire, thank you very much for joining us again. Ali, it was a pleasure meeting you, and we hope to have you back. And so is Simon and Faraz. It's always a pleasure moderating with you. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone, and morning.
Pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.